In 1944, somewhere in France, German reconnaissance aircraft photographed what appeared to be a large American armored division preparing for movement, rows of tanks, artillery positions, trucks lined along roads. Radio chatter consistent with thousands of troops coordinating an operation. Even the sounds of engines and construction drifted through the countryside. To the German command, the evidence was clear. A major American force was assembling in that area. They adjusted their defenses accordingly. There was only one problem. None of it was real. Tanks were made of rubber. The artillery was canvas stretched over air. The trucks were inflatable props that could be carried by 4 men and set up in minutes. The radio traffic came from a handful of operators skilled at imitation. The engine noises were recordings played through large speakers hidden in hedgerows, and the soldiers moving through the area were not a division at all, but a small group of artists, designers, architects, and sound engineers wearing U.S. Army uniforms. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special. Troops later known as the Ghost Army, their job was not to fight. Their job was to be seen, to be heard to, be believed, and to make the enemy move in. Response to something that did not exist. The idea sounds almost absurd. War is usually described in terms of firepower, strategy, and logistics. The Ghost Army operated in a different dimension, perception. They understood that if the enemy believed a division was present, they would act as if it were. They would reposition troops, delay movements, reinforced areas that did not need reinforcement, all based on an illusion. And this illusion worked, over and over again. What makes the Ghost Army remarkable is not that they fooled the Germans once. It is that they did it repeatedly across multiple operations, under constant risk of discovery in areas often close to real fighting. If they had been exposed, they would have faced front-line combat with almost no heavy weapons and little protection. Their survival depended entirely on the enemy continuing to believe the performance, because that is what it was, Performance on a battlefield, a carefully staged show designed to convince the German army that tens of thousands of American soldiers were somewhere they were not. This unit did not destroy enemy divisions. It moved them like pieces on a board, and in doing so, it saved countless lives without firing a shot at the time. Almost no one outside a small circle of commanders knew they existed. Their work was classified. Their missions were secret. Even many American soldiers who passed by their inflatable tanks had no idea they were looking at props. The Ghost Army did not win battles through force. They won them through imagination, and for months, the German army fought against ghosts without ever realizing it. Asterisk, asterisk. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops did not look like a typical military unit. Many of them had never expected to be in the army at all. Before the war, they had been art students, set designers, illustrators, architects, sound technicians, and advertising professionals. Some had worked in New York studios. Others had painted murals, designed theater sets, or worked in radio production. A few would later become well-known artists and designers after the war. They were not selected for their strength. They were selected for their creativity. When the U.S. Army began exploring the idea of large-scale deception, planners realized they needed a different kind of soldier, people who understood how to build convincing illusions. The result was a unit unlike anything else in the military. One group specialized in visual deception. They designed and deployed inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and aircraft that, from a distance or from the air, looked real enough to fool reconnaissance. Another group handled sound. They carried large speakers and recordings of real armored divisions on the move engines. Clanking tracks, shouted orders, construction noise. They could make an empty field sound like thousands of men preparing for battle. A third group focused on radio deception. Skilled operators mimicked the communication patterns of real units, copying their style and rhythm so precisely that German intelligence believed they were intercepting genuine transmissions. And finally, there were the actors. Soldiers trained to behave like members of whatever unit they were pretending to be. They wore the correct insignia, used the right slang, and staged visible activity in villages where German spies might be watching. They were not pretending to fight. They were pretending to exist. This required discipline as strict as any combat unit. Mistakes could be fatal. If a single detail looked wrong, the entire illusion might collapse. They had to study the units they were impersonating, how they moved, how they communicated, even how their camps were laid out. In some cases, they would set up fake headquarters, complete with fake generals, staged conversations, and carefully placed vehicles. Everything was designed to be seen by someone at a distance. The Ghost Army's success depended on being observed. They needed the enemy to look at them and believe. This is what made their job so dangerous. They often operated close to the front lines, within range of enemy patrols and artillery. They had very few weapons compared to real combat units. If discovered, they would have to fight as a small, lightly armed group against real soldiers who had just realized they had been deceived. Yet they carried out mission after mission with a calm that came from understanding their role. They were not there to overpower the enemy. They were there to control what the enemy thought was happening. In a war defined by brute force, the Ghost Army relied on something far more fragile: illusion. The Ghost Army did not appear suddenly in 1944. Its origins began with a simple observation made earlier in the war. The enemy often reacted more to what they believed than to what was actually happening. Military. Planners had long understood the value of deception. Fake radio traffic, dummy positions, and misleading movements had been used for centuries. But the scale of World War II created new opportunities. With aircraft constantly photographing the battlefield and signals intelligence intercepting communications, perception had become as important as firepower. American planners began asking a radical question. What if an entire unit could be built for the purpose of being seen and nothing else? The idea gained momentum after observing British deception operations in North Africa, where inflatable tanks and fake camps had successfully misled German forces. The concept worked, but only in limited ways. What the US Army envisioned was something larger: a mobile deception unit that could create the illusion of an entire division, complete with visual, audio, and radio signatures. A force that could appear anywhere along the front, convince the enemy that a major attack was being prepared, and then disappear before the truth was discovered. To do this, they needed people who thought differently. Recruiters quietly searched art schools, advertising agencies, architecture firms, and radio studios. They were looking for men who understood how to create convincing scenes, how to trick the eye and ear into accepting something that's not real. These men were brought together and trained not just as soldiers, but as illusionists. They studied reconnaissance photos to understand what real military camps looked like from the air. They learned how German intelligence analyzed radio traffic. They practiced deploying inflatable vehicles, quickly and convincingly in open terrain. Every detail mattered. If a tank was placed at the wrong angle, it might cast a shadow that looked suspicious. If radio operators used the wrong phrasing, experienced German listeners might notice. If the soldiers in a fake camp behaved unnaturally, spies could report inconsistencies. The unit was designed to operate like a traveling stage set. Arrive quickly, create the illusion, let the enemy react, then move before the curtain fell. By the time the 23rd Headquarters Special, troops deployed to Europe after the Normandy landings, they were ready to test whether an army built on imagination could influence a war built on destruction. They were about to find out that the answer was yes. Asterisk. The most recognizable tools of the Ghost Army were also the most absurd. Inflatable tanks at first glance, they looked convincing enough. From the air, from a distance, or through binoculars, they had the correct shape, size, and shadow. But up close, they were nothing more than painted rubber and canvas filled with air. A few men could carry one folded in a bag, lay it out on the ground, and inflate it with a small pump in minutes. Suddenly, an empty field looked like an armored battalion. The same applied to artillery pieces, trucks, and even aircraft. Entire vehicle parks could be created where nothing had existed an hour earlier. Roads that had been empty at dawn appeared crowded by noon. But the visual props were only part of the illusion. The ghost. Army learned quickly that realism came from imperfection. Real military camps were messy. Vehicles were not arranged in neat rows. Tracks marked the ground. Equipment was scattered. So they staged disorder deliberately. They dragged heavy objects across dirt to create track marks. They left crates in random places. They hung laundry between vehicles. They even placed fake fuel drums where reconnaissance planes might spot them. Every detail was meant to answer the silent question a German observer would ask, "Does this look real?" At night, the illusion became even more powerful. Spotlights and small fires created the impression of activity. Shadows moved across tents. From a distance, it looked like thousands of men preparing for something important. The key was scale. The ghost. Army did not pretend to be a small unit. They impersonated entire divisions, sometimes up to 30,000 soldiers, and they did it with fewer than 1,000 men. This required speed and precision. They often worked under time pressure, knowing that enemy aircraft could appear at any moment. Within hours, a completely empty landscape could transform into what looked like a major military staging area. Then they waited. They did not need to fire a shot. They only needed the enemy to see. And when German reconnaissance, photos came back showing what appeared to be large American forces where there had been none before. The illusion had done its job. Troops were redirected. Defenses were reinforced in the wrong places. Movements were delayed, all because of tanks that could be deflated and packed into a truck before sunrise. Asterisk, asterisk, if the inflatable tanks fooled the eye, the sound unit fooled the ear. The Ghost Army understood something critical. War is loud. Real armies do not sit quietly in open fields. They make noise constantly. Engines start and stop. Metal clanks. Men shout orders. Trucks shift gears. Construction crews build fortifications. Through the night, silence would expose the illusion faster than anything, so the unit carried something unusual into combat zones large. Speakers and carefully recorded audio of real armored divisions in motion. Before deploying to Europe, sound engineers had recorded hours of genuine military activity. Tanks rolling over different surfaces, troops marching, bridges being assembled, camps being set up. Every sound cataloged and labeled in the field. These recordings were played through powerful speakers mounted on vehicles or hidden behind terrain features. The sound could carry for miles, especially at night when the air was still, to a German listening post. It did not sound like a recording. It sounded like thousands of soldiers preparing for movement. The operators adjusted volume and timing depending on terrain. They knew how sound traveled across valleys, through forests, and over hills. They created the illusion of depth and distance by changing which speakers played at which moments. Sometimes they played the sounds of tanks arriving. Later, they played the sounds of tanks leaving. To an observer, it appeared that entire units were moving through the area. This was not random noise. It was carefully choreographed audio deception. The sound team often worked in dangerous proximity to the front line. They needed to be close enough for the enemy to hear them clearly, but far enough to avoid direct engagement. If discovered, they had little protection. Their survival depended on the enemy believing what they were hearing. And the Germans did believe. Intercepted. Reports showed that enemy commanders frequently noted heavy vehicle movement in areas where the Ghost Army had been operating. Troops were repositioned based on sounds that had come from speakers hidden behind. Sure, the battlefield had gained a new dimension. You no longer needed an army to make the sound of one. And in war, sometimes sound alone was enough to change decisions. Asterisk, asterisk, visuals fooled the eyes. Sound fooled the ears. But to truly convince German intelligence, the Ghost Army had to fool the mind. That was the job of the radio operators. German signals intelligence was sophisticated. They listened constantly to Allied radio traffic, mapping out unit locations based on call signs, message patterns, and communication habits. They did not need to see a division to know it was there. They could hear it. So the Ghost Army had to sound exactly like a real division. This was far more complicated than simply sending fake messages. Every American unit had its own radio personality. Operators developed habits over time, certain rhythms in speech, preferred phrases, pacing, even mistakes. German listeners had learned to recognize these patterns. The Ghost Army studied them carefully. Radio specialists memorized the communication styles of real divisions. They practiced copying them until they could imitate the cadence perfectly. They learned which units talked more, which talked less, and how often they checked in. When the deception began, they did not flood the airwaves with noise. They recreated the exact radio footprint of a real unit. Messages were sent at realistic intervals. Routine updates, logistical chatter, requests for supplies, all the mundane details that made transmissions believable. Sometimes they even simulated arguments or confusion because real radio traffic was rarely clean. To German intelligence, this was convincing evidence that thousands of American troops were operating in the area. The most remarkable part was scale. A handful of radio operators could create the illusion of an entire command network stretching across miles. By coordinating their transmissions, they simulated multiple units communicating with each other, forming a web of signals that matched what German analysts expected to hear from a real division. And they did this while parked in fields next to inflatable tanks and hidden speakers. The three layers of deception, visual, audio, and radio, reinforced each other. If the Germans saw tanks from the air, heard engines at night, and intercepted believable radio traffic, the conclusion was unavoidable. A large American force was present. In reality, it was less than 1,000 men creating a performance detailed enough to fool one of the most advanced intelligence services in the world. They were not just pretending to be an army. They were thinking like one. By the time the Ghost Army arrived in France after the Normandy landings, the theory behind their work had been carefully developed. Now it had to function. Under real conditions, their first major operation took place in an environment far from safe. The front lines were still active. German patrols were present, and reconnaissance aircraft regularly passed overhead. There was no controlled test area. If the illusion failed, they would be exposed immediately. The mission was simple in concept and complex in execution. A real American armored division was preparing to move to a new position. To prevent the Germans from noticing the relocation, the Ghost Army would remain behind and create the impression that the division had never left. They moved into the vacated area as soon as the real troops departed. Inflatable tanks were deployed where real ones had stood. Fake artillery replaced the originals. Trucks were staged along the same roads. The sound unit began playing recordings of armored movement as if nothing had changed. Radio operators copied the exact transmission patterns of the division that had just left, maintaining the same communication rhythm so German listeners would detect no difference. From the air, the camp looked intact. From the ground, it sounded active. On the radio, it felt alive. The Ghost Army watched the sky constantly, knowing that German reconnaissance planes would soon arrive to photograph the area. When they did, the photos showed what appeared to be the same. Armored divisions still in place. The Germans did not react to the real movement happening elsewhere, because they believed the threat remained where it had been. The deception worked, for the first time in combat conditions. The Ghost Army had successfully replaced a real unit with an illusion, and the enemy had accepted it as reality. This success changed how commanders viewed the unit. They were no longer an experiment. They were a strategic tool, and for the men inside the Ghost Army, it confirmed something extraordinary. They could stand in an open field, surrounded by rubber tanks and hidden speakers, within range of enemy forces, and shape the decisions of an entire opposing army, all without firing a shot. Asterisk, asterisk. The true measure of the Ghost Army's success was not whether their illusions looked convincing. It was whether the Germans changed their behavior because of them. After the first operations in France, Intelligence reports began showing something remarkable. German units were repositioning in response to threats that did not exist. Defensive lines were reinforced in areas where the Ghost Army had staged fake divisions. Artillery was aimed at empty fields. The enemy was not just seeing the illusion, they were acting on it, in one case. German commanders delayed a planned counterattack because aerial reconnaissance suggested a large American force was assembling nearby. That force was the Ghost Army. Working quietly with inflatable vehicles and hidden speakers, the delay gave real American units time to regroup and strengthen their positions. Elsewhere, in another operation, German troops withdrew from a village because they believed they were about to be surrounded by an advancing division. That division was made of air for the men of the 23rd Headquarters. These moments were both satisfying and unsettling. They could see the effects of their work without ever witnessing the enemy directly. Their battlefield was invisible. Their victories were measured in movements that never happened, in attacks that were never launched. Sometimes they would hear distant artillery fire aimed at positions where their fake camps had stood hours earlier. After they had already packed up and moved, the shells would fall on empty ground. The illusion lingered even after they were gone. Asterisk, asterisk. This was a strange kind of warfare. There were no captured positions, no destroyed equipment, no visible signs of success. Yet entire tactical decisions were being shaped by what the Ghost Army agreed. It required patience and precision. They had to trust that somewhere beyond the hills, German officers were studying reconnaissance photos, listening to intercepted radio chatter, and making choices based on what they believed they were seeing, choices influenced entirely by a performance. The Ghost Army had discovered something powerful in modern war. Reality could be manufactured, and the enemy would respond as if it were true. Asterisk, asterisk for the men of the Ghost Army. The deception did not stop at equipment and radio signals. They had to live the part. German intelligence did not rely only on aircraft and intercepted transmissions. There were informants, collaborators, and spies in villages across France and Belgium. People who watched American troops pass through and reported what they saw. So the Ghost Army became actors. When they entered a town, it behaved exactly like the unit they were impersonating. If they were pretending to be an armored division, they talked loudly about tank movements in cafes where strangers could overhear them. They complained about engine repairs, discussed fuel shortages, and mentioned fictional officers by name. They wore the correct shoulder patches. They drove vehicles with the right markings. They even staged arguments in public to make their presence feel natural. The goal was simple. If someone reported their observations to the Germans, every detail would support the illusion. Sometimes this required improvisation. If a local asked questions, they had to answer convincingly without revealing the truth. If children wandered into their camp, they had to keep them from touching inflatable equipment that would expose everything. They became experts at creating controlled chaos. It's a kind that made military camps look real. Laundry hung between fake vehicles. Crates were scattered. Tools lay on the ground as if mechanics had stepped away. Moments earlier, nothing was left to chance. Even their mistakes were planned. They learned that perfection looked suspicious. So they staged minor problems, a broken truck, a delayed supply delivery, small inconveniences that made the scene feel authentic. All of this happened within range of enemy patrols and artillery. If a German unit had walked into one of these camps, the Ghost Army would have had to fight for real with very little to defend themselves. That knowledge never left them. They were performing a role that could collapse at any moment, revealing how fragile their position truly was. Yet they continued, day after day, living inside an illusion so detailed that the enemy believed it, and so dangerous that discovery could have been fatal. They were not just building fake armies, they were becoming them. Asterisk. The Ghost Army did not work in isolation. They often operated only a few miles, sometimes less, from real American units engaged in active combat. The deception had to be close enough to feel believable, but far enough that the enemy would not accidentally collide with the illusion. This balancing act was constant. If they positioned their fake division too far from the front, German reconnaissance would question why such a large force was idle. If they placed it too close, a patrol might stumble directly into inflatable tanks and expose everything. They had to understand the battlefield almost as well as the commanders planning real attacks. Before each mission, they studied maps carefully. They learned where actual units were located, where movements were planned, and where the enemy was likely to be watching. Their job was to fill in the spaces between reality and expectation. In some cases, the Ghost Army's position was so close to active fighting that they could hear real artillery exchanges while setting up fake camps. The contrast was surreal. Nearby soldiers prepared for combat with real weapons, while the Ghost Army inflated rubber tanks designed only to be seen from the sky. Sometimes real soldiers passed by and laughed at the sight of inflatable equipment. Many had no idea what the purpose was. Some thought it was training material. Very few understood that these props were part of a deception influencing German strategy miles away. The Ghost Army had to be careful not to interfere with genuine operations. If a real unit moved unexpectedly through their area, they had to adapt quickly, adjusting the illusion so it still made sense to outside observers. Their battlefield was dynamic, unpredictable, and invisible, and the risk was always present. If the Germans launched an artillery strike based on their deception, it might land dangerously close. If patrols advanced farther than expected, they might encounter the illusion directly. The Ghost Army lived in a narrow space between performance and exposure, operating beside real war while creating a false version of it for the enemy to see. They were close enough to danger to feel it, but their survival depended on remaining just far enough away to keep the illusion intact. Asterisk. One of the most important moments in the Ghost Army's history came when their deception did more than confuse the enemy. It protected real soldiers from being overwhelmed. A U.S. division preparing to reposition needed time. If the Germans detected the movement too early, they could launch an attack against exposed units during the transition. The window for vulnerability was small but deadly. The Ghost Army sent in to cover that window. As the real division quietly withdrew under cover of darkness, the 23rd headquarters moved into its place before sunrise. Inflatable tanks went up where real ones had stood hours earlier. Radio traffic continued exactly as before. Sound units played the noise of engines and construction through the night. From the German perspective, nothing had changed. Reconnaissance photos taken the next day showed what appeared to be the same armored presence in the same location. Intercepted radio messages confirmed it. The illusion was complete. The Germans made their decision based on this information. They delayed any movement in that sector, leaving the American force remained fully operational. That delay gave the real division the time it needed to relocate safely and prepare for its next mission. Without interference, no battle took place. No shots were fired, but the absence of an attack was the result of the Ghost Army's work. The division they had protected would never know how close it had come to being targeted during its movement. Many of the soldiers involved would never learn that. Their safety depended on inflatable tanks and hidden speakers miles away. This was how the Ghost Army measured success, not by what happened, but by what did not happen. Because of them, they began to realize that their role was more than distraction. They were shaping the timing of the war itself, buying hours and days that real units desperately needed. Time in war is often more valuable than territory, and the Ghost Army had learned how to create it. Asterisk. Asterisk. As the Ghost Army's operations grew more complex, the deception moved beyond equipment and radio chatter. They began impersonating. Leadership German intelligence did not only track units, they tracked commanders. The presence of certain generals in an area often signaled preparation for a major operation. If a well-known officer was believed to be nearby, the enemy assumed something important was about to happen, so the Ghost Army added another layer to the illusion. They staged the arrival of high-ranking officers, elected Soldiers were dressed and briefed to play the role of generals or senior staff. They traveled through villages in marked vehicles, held staged meetings in visible locations, and behaved exactly as important officers would. They made sure to be seen. Local civilians, informants, and collaborators would notice. Word would spread. Reports would reach German ears that a senior American commander had been spotted near a certain town, and that information would reinforce everything else. The Ghost Army had built. If reconnaissance photos showed tanks, radio intercepts confirmed activity, and spies reported the presence of a general. The conclusion was inevitable. A major operation was being prepared. These performances required careful planning. The actors had to know how officers behaved, how they spoke, how they carried themselves, how they interacted with soldiers. Even small details mattered. They would enter cafes, sit at tables, unfold maps dramatically, and discuss fictional plans in voices loud enough to be overheard. Every movement was deliberate. The Ghost Army had turned deception into theater, with the battlefield as its stage and the enemy as its audience. And the Germans kept watching, trying to interpret the performance as reality. They never realized they were observing a play. By this point, the Ghost Army's work resembled something closer to stage production than military deployment. Every mission began like setting up a performance. They would arrive at a location with trucks full of deflated vehicles, speakers, cables, radios, props, and uniforms. Within hours, empty landscape transformed into what looked like a fully operational military camp. But unlike a theater audience, the Germans did not know they were watching a show. The success of each operation depended on timing. The illusion had to appear at exactly the right moment, not too early, not too late. If the fake division appeared before real movements elsewhere, the deception would feel suspicious. If it appeared too late, the enemy might already have adjusted. The Ghost Army learned to synchronize their performances with real military plans. They were told where actual units would move, when attacks were scheduled, and which areas needed distraction. Their role was to create a convincing alternative story that the Germans would believe instead of the truth. They built scenes designed to answer questions. Before the enemy could ask them, why are there tanks here? Because reconnaissance photos show them. Why is there activity at night? Because the sound of engines and construction can be heard. Why are officers present? Because they were seen by locals. Why does the radio traffic match? Because it is identical to what a real division would. Transmit every piece supported the others. The battlefield became a script, and the Ghost Army followed it carefully. Knowing that a single mistake could unravel the entire performance, they worked quickly, often setting up at night and dismantling everything before dawn. In the morning, the landscape would be empty again, as if nothing had ever happened, except the Germans had already seen it, and they were reacting. The Ghost Army had turned theater into a weapon, one that relied not on destruction, but on belief. German commanders prided themselves on careful analysis. They did not rely on a single source of information. Reconnaissance photos were compared with radio intercepts. Reports from informants were checked against aerial observations. Patterns were studied before decisions were made. The Ghost Army understood this process. Their goal was not to fool one. It's a method of observation. It was to fool all of them at once. When a deception operation began, the illusion appeared everywhere the Germans were trained to look. Aircraft saw tanks. Listening posts heard engines and radio chatter. Local observers reported troop movements and officer activity. Each piece of information confirmed the others. This created a trap. German intelligence officers, confident in their thorough methods, would cross-check data and find consistency. That consistency convinced them they were seeing reality. In truth, they were seeing a carefully constructed performance designed specifically to withstand that scrutiny. The more carefully they analyzed the evidence, the deeper they fell into the illusion. This was not luck. It was design. The Ghost Army had studied how the enemy thought. They knew that intelligence officers expected certain patterns from real divisions, and they recreated those patterns perfectly. The result was powerful. German units were sometimes redirected miles away from real American movements because the evidence suggested a larger threat somewhere else. Defensive lines were strengthened in the wrong places. Resources were wasted, guarding areas that contained nothing. All because intelligence officers trusted their own analysis. The Ghost Army did not defeat German intelligence by overwhelming it, they defeated it by feeding it exactly what it expected to find. And the enemy never realized that the consistency they trusted was part of the deception. Asterisk for all their success. There were moments when the illusion came dangerously close to collapsing. One operation placed the Ghost Army in an area where German patrols were known to move unpredictably through forests and villages. The terrain made it difficult to maintain distance, and visibility was limited. If a patrol wandered too far in the wrong direction, they could walk directly into a field of inflatable tanks. That is exactly what almost happened. Late one evening, scouts reported movement approaching the edge of the fake camp. The Ghost Army had just finished setting up dozens of inflatable vehicles and sound equipment. There was no time to dismantle everything if the Germans reached the camp. The deception would be exposed instantly, and exposure would mean combat. Real combat against a unit armed mostly with props and light weapons. The men took defensive positions, preparing for a fight they had never trained for. They could hear voices in the distance, boots moving through brush, metal equipment clinking. The patrol was close, too close. Then something unexpected happened. The sound unit, already set up for the illusion, began playing recordings of armored vehicles starting up and moving. Engines roared through hidden speakers. The noise echoed across the trees as if a large force was mobilizing. The German patrol stopped. They listened to them. It sounded like they had walked straight into the path of a massive armored unit preparing for movement. Outnumbered and unsure of what lay ahead in the darkness, they withdrew without advancing further. The illusion saved them, not by design, but by instinct. That night, the Ghost Army understood how fragile their position truly was. They were operating on the edge of discovery, relying on the enemy to continue believing what they were hearing and seeing if the Germans had taken a few more steps forward. The war for the Ghost Army would have become very real. Instead, the performance held, and the patrol disappeared back into the forest, convinced they had avoided something far more dangerous than a field of rubber tanks. Asterisk. Not every close call ended as smoothly as the one in the forest. During another operation, the Ghost Army faced a different kind of threat, one that came from the sky. German reconnaissance aircraft were flying lower than usual, likely due to poor weather and cloud cover. From high altitude, inflatable tanks were convincing. From lower altitude, the details became more dangerous. Shadows, texture, even the way equipment interacted with the ground could give away the truth. The men watched nervously as a plane circled overhead longer than expected. It did not simply pass by and continue. It returned for a second pass, flying lower each time. This was the moment they had always feared. If the pilot recognized what he was seeing, word would spread quickly through German command. The Ghost Army's effectiveness would be destroyed overnight. Every future deception would be questioned. They could do nothing but wait. The camp had been carefully staged. Tracks marked the dirt. Equipment was scattered. Soldiers moved naturally between positions, pretending to perform routine tasks. From the ground, everything looked real. But from the air, the illusion depended on distance. The plane circled again, then turned away and disappeared into the clouds later. Intelligence reports confirmed that German forces had reacted exactly as expected. Believing a large American unit was still present in the area, the pilot had seen what he expected to see, and expectation had filled in the rest. For the Ghost Army, this was a powerful lesson. Their deception did not rely only on how well they built the illusion. It relied on how strongly the enemy believed in their own observations. Reality, they realized, could be shaped not just by what was shown, but by what the observer expected to find. And as long as they understood that expectation, The illusion could survive even the closest inspection. Asterisk, asterisk, as word spread quietly among Allied commanders about the Ghost Army's effectiveness, their missions became more tightly integrated with real operations. They were no longer simply replacing units that had moved. They were working in coordination with active offensives, sometimes operating just behind the lines of real combat. This created unusual interactions. Real soldiers would pass through areas where the Ghost Army had set up elaborate illusions. They would see inflatable tanks, staged camps, and soldiers behaving in ways that seemed slightly theatrical. Most had no idea what they were looking at. Some laughed. Others were confused. A few guessed that something unusual was happening but were given no explanation. Secrecy was essential. If too many people knew the truth, the risk of information leaking, intentionally or not, increased. Even Allied soldiers were not told what the Ghost Army was doing unless they absolutely needed to know. This meant the Ghost Army had to maintain their performance even in front of their own side. They behaved as if they were a real division at all times. They used proper terminology, followed military routines, and maintained the appearance of readiness. To outside observers, they were simply another unit in the massive Allied advance. Meanwhile, real combat units depended on the time and space the Ghost Army created. When attacks were planned elsewhere, the Ghost Army's job was to hold the enemy's attention. When divisions needed to regroup or reposition, the Ghost Army stayed behind to make it look as if nothing had changed. The relationship was silent but critical. Real soldiers fought and moved based on strategies that often depended on illusions happening miles away. They never saw the connection, but it was there. The Ghost Army had become part of the machinery of the war, not through force, but through perception. They stood beside real soldiers, performing a version of war that only the enemy was meant to believe. Asterisk. One of the Ghost Army's most important missions came as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine River in early 1945. This was a major turning point. The Rhine was the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The Germans knew this, and had concentrated defenses along likely crossing points. Any real buildup of forces near the river would be watched carefully. The Allies needed the enemy looking in the wrong place. The Ghost Army was sent to create that distraction. They set up a massive illusion, suggesting that a large American force was preparing to cross the Rhine. At a location where no crossing was actually planned, inflatable tanks lined the riverbanks. Fake artillery pointed toward the opposite shore. Sound units played the noise of heavy construction as if bridges were being assembled. Radio operators transmitted the signals of a division coordinating an assault from across the river. German observers could see everything they expected to see before a major crossing, so they responded. Artillery was repositioned. Troops were moved to reinforce that sector. Defensive attention shifted toward the illusion while the real crossing preparations happened elsewhere. With far less resistance, when the actual American forces crossed the Rhine at a different location, they faced significantly reduced opposition. The Ghost Army had not fired a shot. Yet their work influenced one of the most important operations of the war in Europe. For the men involved, this mission demonstrated the full potential of what they had been doing for months. They were no longer just confusing local commanders. They were shaping decisions at a strategic level, influencing how the German army defended its own borders. An army made of air had helped open the way into Germany itself. Asterisk, asterisk. The Ghost Army rarely saw the direct results of their work. They did not occupy captured cities. They did not count destroyed enemy equipment. Their successes were invisible, scattered across reports and movements happening far away from where they stood. But over time, patterns became clear. German units repeatedly repositioned in response to threats that did not exist. Attacks were delayed. Defenses were reinforced in the wrong sectors. Entire formations moved based on intelligence shaped by inflatable equipment, recorded sound, and staged performances. Historians later estimated that the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 major deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. In each case, they impersonated divisions far larger than themselves. sometimes influencing the movements of tens of thousands of enemy troops. The real impact of their work is difficult to measure precisely. How do you count battles that never happened? How do you measure lives saved by attacks that were never launched? What can be seen is the time they created. Time for real divisions to move safely. Time for regrouping after difficult engagements. Time for surprise to remain intact during major offensives. Time in war can mean survival. The Ghost Army became experts at manufacturing it. They operated quietly, often packing up their illusions before anyone fully understood what had taken place. By the time the enemy realized something was wrong, the Ghost Army had already moved on to the next performance. Their battlefield was measured not in territory, but in decisions. And again, the enemy made those decisions based on ghosts. For the men inside the Ghost Army, the strangest part of their service was not the danger. It was the feeling that they were participating in a war, looked nothing like the one everyone else described. They lived near the front lines. They heard artillery, saw destroyed towns, and passed real soldiers heading into combat. Yet their daily work involved inflating rubber tanks, setting up speakers, pretending to be thousands of people they were not. Some found it surreal. Others found it darkly humorous. A few struggled with the idea that while other units faced direct combat, their role was to perform an elaborate illusion. But over time, their perspective changed. They began to see the effect of their work. Reports filtered down that German units had reacted to their deceptions. Movements had been altered. Operations elsewhere had succeeded with less resistance. They realized they were not avoiding the war. They were influencing it in a way few others could. There was also constant tension. They knew that if discovered, they would be thrown into real combat with minimal protection. Their safety depended entirely on maintaining the illusion. Every mission carried the quiet understanding that exposure could be deadly. Some of the men later recalled the odd mixture of creativity and fear that defined their experience. They were artists building stage sets under the threat of artillery, designers arranging props while knowing that enemy patrols might be nearby. They were using imagination as a shield, and it worked. By the end of the war, many of them felt a strange pride. They had served in a unit that proved something unexpected, that deception, when done with precision, could be as powerful as weapons. They had fought a war without fighting, and they had done it well. Asterisk, asterisk, when the war ended. The men of the Ghost Army returned home like millions of other soldiers. But unlike most units, they were told not to talk about what they had done. Their missions had been classified from the beginning. The methods they used, visual deception, sound projection, radio imitation, and staged behavior, were considered too valuable to reveal. Military planners believed these techniques could be used again in future conflicts, so the story stayed hidden. For decades, the Ghost Army existed only in quiet memories and private conversations between the men who had served in it. They could tell stories about Europe, about travel, about strange moments near the front lines, but not about the inflatable tanks or the stage performances that had defined their work. Some of them went on to become well-known artists, designers, and architects. Their wartime experience influenced their creativity, but they rarely spoke publicly about how it had shaped them. Meanwhile, the official history of World War II focused on battles, generals, and strategies involving firepower and territory. There was little room in that narrative. For an army that had fought with illusion, the secrecy was not a punishment, it was a recognition that what they had done was unusual and potentially useful again, only many years later. As documents were declassified and historians began looking deeper into specialized units, did the story begin to emerge? People were surprised. An entire unit dedicated to deception. Artists and sound engineers shaping enemy decisions. Inflatable tanks and hidden speakers. Influencing the movements of real armies. It sounded like fiction. But it had been kept secret precisely because it was real and because it had worked. Asterisk, asterisk. For nearly half a century, the story of the Ghost Army remained largely unknown to the public. The men who had served in the unit returned to ordinary lives. Some built careers in art, design, architecture, and advertising. A few became well known in their fields, but none of them were recognized for what they had done during the war. When people asked about their service, they gave vague answers. They had been in Europe. They had worked near the front. They had been part of a special unit. The details stayed unspoken. This silence was not only imposed from above, it became a habit. Their experience did not fit easily into conversations about the war. There were no stories of firefights or captured positions. Explaining that they had fought with inflatable tanks and recorded sound seemed almost absurd without context. So they said little. Meanwhile, military historians focused on large battles and famous commanders. The Ghost Army's work was buried in classified reports and overlooked files. Scattered across archives that few people examined closely, it was not until decades later, when declassified documents began to surface, that researchers started connecting the pieces. Old reports described deception operations with unusual detail. Veterans were interviewed. Photographs of inflatable equipment were rediscovered. Gradually, the picture became clear. An entire unit had operated for months across Europe, shaping enemy decisions through illusion, and almost no one had known. The silence had preserved the secret, but it had also hidden one of the most unusual stories of the war. When the men of the Ghost Army returned home, many of them stepped back into the creative lives they had left behind. Some became successful painters. Others worked as illustrators, designers, architects, and filmmakers. A few would later become recognized names in the American art world. Their careers unfolded quietly, without any public connection to the strange unit they had once been part of. Yet, experience had changed them. They had spent months using art, sound, and performance as tools in a real conflict. They had learned how perception could be shaped, how environments could be constructed to influence behavior, and how small details could alter the way people understood what they were seeing. These lessons did not disappear when the war ended, in subtle ways. Their wartime work influenced their later creations. Their understanding of space, illusion, staging, and atmosphere had been tested under extreme conditions. They had practiced deception not as entertainment, but as survival. Some of them later admitted that their time in the Ghost Army had been the most unusual and formative period of their lives. They had proven that creativity could operate in places where it had never been expected, on a battlefield, under threat, shaping the decisions of an enemy army. But because the story remained secret for so long, this connection between their art and their service stayed invisible to the world. They were simply artists who had served in the war. Only later did people begin to realize that. For these men, art had not paused during the war. It had become a weapon. Asterisk, asterisk, long after the war ended. Military planners began to study what the Ghost Army had accomplished, not because of how unusual it sounded, but because of how effective it had been. The idea that perception could be manipulated on such a large scale forced a shift in thinking. Warfare was no longer only about strength, numbers, and firepower. It was also about information, observation, and belief. If an enemy could be convinced that something existed when it did not, their decisions could be guided without direct confrontation. This concept did not disappear with World War II. It evolved. Modern military deception, camouflage, electronic warfare, misinformation, psychological operations all trace part of their thinking back to lessons learned by units like the Ghost Army. The tools changed, but the principle remained the same: control what the enemy thinks is happening, and you control how they act. The Ghost Army had demonstrated this with inflatable tanks and hidden speakers. Later generations would do it with radar signals, electronic interference, and digital misinformation. But the foundation was laid in fields in France and along the Rhine, where artists in uniform built entire divisions out of air. They proved that an army did not always need to exist physically to have real impact. Sometimes it only needed to be believed. Asterisk, asterisk, the men of the Ghost Army never stormed a beach. They never charged across open fields under fire. They never fought in the way most soldiers did, and yet, they shaped the battlefield in ways few units ever could. They understood something that war had made increasingly clear. The enemy does not react to reality. The enemy reacts to what it believes reality to be. So they built a different kind of weapon, not out of steel or gunpowder, but out of canvas, sound, radio waves, and performance. They created tanks that could be folded into bags, armies that could be packed into trucks, battles that existed only in the mind of the enemy, and the enemy moved accordingly. Entire divisions were redirected. Attacks were delayed. Defenses were misplaced. Time was created where none existed before, all because fewer than 1,000 men knew how to make something unreal feel convincing. For decades, their story remained quiet. It did not fit the familiar images of war. There were no dramatic victories to point to, no captured territory, no visible proof, only the absence of disaster. The absence of attacks that never came. The absence of lives that were never lost. The Ghost Army did not win battles by destroying the enemy. They won by convincing the enemy to fight. Something that was never there, and in doing so, they proved a strange, powerful truth. Sometimes, the most effective force on a battlefield is not the one that exists, but the one the enemy believes exists.